Okay. All right, so tonight we want to talk about landlord and tenant. I've got the slides here. Well, we could do license law and rule again if you want to.
Sure. That's great. Let's do it.
There's already like 75%.
I got a question.
Fall asleep tonight. If we go through everything we did last week, I will.
I already listened to your video today for that one, so you can't do me like that. That's double trouble.
What? Landlord and tenant?
Oh, well, yeah, I listened to that too.
Oh, okay. So turn to page, chapter 11, page 325. Up to this point, Josh, that door unlocked. I don't remember.
It's unlocked.
It is. Okay. Thank you. Everything up to this point in the class has been from the perspective of ownership. If you remember all the way back in chapter 2, we talked about the difference between a freehold estate and a non-freehold estate. You remember that? What do we say freehold meant? What does freehold mean? It means ownership, right? So we finally, 10 chapters later, make it to the non-freehold estates. If ownership is freehold, then what do you think non-freehold means? Something other than ownership, and that only leaves leasing, right? So non-freehold estates are leases. And there's a lot of different ways that leases can be structured, so we need to talk about what those different ways are. What are the different legal structures of leases? How is the rent paid? How does that change based on the structure of the lease? So, we're going to talk about these 4 main categories of leases. These are the 4 ways that a lease can legally be structured. And realistically, they relate to how they end more than anything else. The thing with leases is that because they're for a limited amount of time, it is when they end that signifies the type of lease it is. Does that make sense? Because it's limited by time, we really focus on the end of the lease more than anything else when we're talking about how leases are structured. So about the first one, the estate for years, or the tenancy for years. This is one of the most commonly confused things on the exam because it has the phrase for years in there. It doesn't have to be for years. An estate for years is any definite period of time. So any lease that's for a definite period of time. The problem is you don't even know what that means. How many of you have leased an apartment or a house or something like that? Was it for a definite period of time?
A year.
That's not a definite period of time.
That's an indefinite.
It's an indefinite period of time, and here's how I know that. What did it say about the end of that lease? Oh, it said you leased it for a year, but then what did it say happened at the end of it? It automatically renewed and converted to what? Month to month. Something that automatically renews, folks, is not for a definite period of time. If it automatically renews, it's for a very indefinite period of time. That is not an estate for years. An estate for years is a lease which has a very definite end date. It does not renew itself. When it's over, it's over. No discussion. Everybody with me on that? These are how your commercial leases are mostly structured. Most commercial leases are structured as estates for years. Here's the thing, and this is what they're going to use on a test. This is exactly what they're going to use to trip you up. A lease for a definite 2 weeks. What kind of tenancy is it? It's an estate for years. And they do that, they say a definite 2 weeks because they feel like, well, I can't answer for years because it ain't for a year. Yes, you can. Yes, you can. Any definite period of time is an estate for years. Can I have an estate for years for a month?
Yes.
Yeah. Can I have it for 6 months? Can I have it for 99 years?
Yes.
Sure. Any definite period of time is an estate for years. It automatically terminates at its expiration. Rather than automatically renew, it automatically ends when it expires. Nobody needs to give notice. If you've got a residential lease, don't you have to give notice when you want it to end?
Yes.
If you're going to move out, don't you have to give notice to the landlord? Or they have to give notice to you if they're not going to renew your lease. In an estate for years, that's not required. There's no notice requirement. It is expected that you understand as a tenant, your lease is over tomorrow. If you got a lease that expires January 31st and it's in a estate for years, is anybody going to call and remind you that you've got to be out by the 31st? Is anybody going to give you notice that you got to be out by the 31st? No. You better be out. It's for a definite period of time. Okay? Residential leases are usually structured as periodic tenancies. A periodic tenancy, or an estate from period to period. Here's the key difference. What did we say an estate for years does automatically? Automatically terminates. What do you think a periodic tenancy automatically does? It automatically renews itself. This thing is never dead until somebody kills it. Either the landlord or the tenant have to give notice in writing and say, we don't want this to renew, we want it to end. Because if nobody gives notice, guess what the lease does? It renews itself. If nobody gives notice, it renews itself. Simple as that. We're going to have a new lease? Does that make sense? All right. So let's talk about that notice. The state says that if you're going to have a periodic tenancy, you've got to have minimum notice time frames, minimum amounts of time to tell the tenant or to tell the landlord that you don't want this thing to renew. In other words, you can't just give them notice and they got to be out tomorrow. There's a minimum amount of advance notice you have to give. And you've got to know these three. You're going to see these on a test. All right, these notice time frames, you need to know them. The longer your lease was for, the longer notice you have to give. Does that make sense? If you had a longer term lease, it's expected that you will give more notice to terminate that lease. So, if you have a week-to-week lease, how much notice do you have to give?
2 days.
2 days. If you have a month-to-month lease,
7 days.
you have to give 7 days, 1 week, for month-to-month. And if you have anything longer than month-to-month, what's the minimum amount of notice you have to give?
1 month.
1 month. Now remember, this notice works from both perspectives. Does the landlord have to give you notice if they want you out?
Yes.
Does the tenant have to give notice if they don't want to stay?
Yes.
Either way, we've got to have notice. Otherwise, this lease is going to do what?
Renew.
It's going to renew itself. What kind of lease do we call that? That is a periodic tenancy. Okay? Could the lease call for longer notice than this?
Yes.
Yeah, this is minimum notice. So you could have a lease that says you have to give 60 days notice. Couldn't you?
Yes.
Yep. It can call for more notice than this. It just can't call for less than this. Month to month. You hear that phrase a lot when you talk about leases. You hear it a lot because it is sort of the default for residential leases. But it's actually the default for any lease in North Carolina. And what do we mean by the default? What does that mean? The norm, yeah. What you get if you don't ask for something special. The default, right? That's what you get. If you go to McDonald's and you order a double cheeseburger, what comes on it? I don't even know. What is it? Ketchup, mustard,
Pickles.
onions, and pickles, right? If I say I want a double cheeseburger, do I have to say I want ketchup, onions, mustard, and pickles on there, or is it just going to come that way? It's going to come that way because that's the default. Does that make sense? And with a lease in North Carolina, if you don't ask for something special or structure it some other way, guess what you're going to get? Which is month to month. So if you have a lease that doesn't specify something different than month to month, you've got a month to month lease. What if you have an oral lease? What do you think it's going to be? It's going to be month to month, because the only way you could specify something different would be to put it in what? In writing. Does that make sense for everybody? So if you don't have an agreement to do something different, you're going to end up with a month-to-month lease. Be careful of this. The fact that we recognize oral leases in North Carolina is a big problem when you become a property manager. Josh, you are managing a property and you've given the tenant notice that you do not intend to renew their lease. Okay? You show up tomorrow morning when they're supposed to be out of the property and they're still there. So you knock on the door and you say, you know, we gave you notice, you were supposed to be out yesterday, your lease has expired, why are you still here? And they start making excuses that they couldn't get the movers there, but they got friends coming to help them move, and they'll be out by Friday. And can we just give you $200 for this week and then we'll be out by Friday? What's your answer going to be?
No.
Why?
Because it has to be, it wasn't, I didn't tell them, and I told them too soon. I didn't give them enough time.
No, you gave them notice. You gave them notice. So what do you say to them when they offer you $200 for being there that extra week?
No, because it's a month to month.
No, because if you took it, you would be creating a month-to-month lease. So how long did you just lease that property to them for $200? A whole month. Because, remember, that's what I said. That's like walking up to the counter at McDonald's and saying, I want a double cheeseburger. What's going to come on it? Ketchup, onions, pickles, and if you don't like onions, you better damn well say what? No onions. So the only way you take rent from somebody if you don't intend for it to be month to month is you have a written agreement that it's not month to month. So when they offer you that partial month's rent, you either don't take it or you get a written agreement that says this is only for this week because you were a holdover tenant. This is not, does that make sense? You got to put it in writing, because if you don't put it in writing, you're going to get month to month. Good with that? So is taking partial rent a very dangerous thing?
Yes.
You better believe it. Absolutely. Okay? But you like you might have a question.
A light bulb.
A light bulb?
What
Okay.
happened to the freaking vending machine?
I'm sorry?
What happened to the vending machine?
I have no idea.
Because I was like, you know, I said 80% chance I'll fall asleep in class tonight. That went up to like 95 when I realized that I have no access to snacks tonight. So.
I have. Are you saying there's not a vending machine there?
No, it's just not working.
Well, you acted like I monitor it 24 hours a day or something when you said.
He's really
He
upset.
said, "What happened to the vending machine?" I said, "What did you mean?" And he kept going like I knew
You work in the
exactly.
building, I would assume you would know.
Why would I go to the vending machine?
It's got good stuff in it. There's a Snicker bar in there that's calling my name right now.
Did you shake it?
Oh. Trust me, I plugged it back into the wall and tried to swipe my card like 3 times. I said, come on, please.
So, we also need to talk about something called this. So far, we've talked about what? We've talked about the tenancy for years, right? The states for years. And what's the key about that? It's for a what? A definite period of time, and it automatically does what? It expires, terminates when it expires, right? That's the key to an estate for years. The periodic tenancy, what does it do at its expiration? It automatically renews. So this thing only ends if what happens? If one or the other gives notice, not just the tenant, one or the other. Either one of them can end this thing, but somebody has to end it. You can't just make it. Here's the thing. As a landlord, you just can't make an assumption that they're going to leave. And as a tenant, you can't make an assumption that they think you're going to leave. If you plan not to be there next month, or you plan for them not to be there next month, you have to give written notice. What if the tenant moves out and never gives notice? Do they owe rent for that next month?
Yes.
Even though their lease has already expired, do they owe rent for that next month? Yes, because that lease renewed itself because they failed to give notice. That's what's so different about a periodic tenancy, okay? And then now we want to talk about something called an estate at will. When you do something at will, it means you're not bound to it. It means you're not tied up with it. It means you don't have to do it. If it's at will, can you just stop doing it? Yeah. So it's not really a lease at all, is it? Because didn't a lease indicate that the tenant is bound to stay there for some period of time and the landlord is bound to allow the tenant to stay there for some period of time? What could the landlord say at any time if you have an estate at will? Get out. And what could the tenant do anytime they wanted to? I'm out. And nobody has any requirements to the other. That's an estate at will. Now, here's the problem with this. If I just pay rent and I don't have any agreement to the contrary, what do I have? I have month to month, right? So what's the only way to actually set up one of these estates at will? Either it's free, or if we paid rent, we'd have to have what? We'd have to have a written agreement saying this is not a lease. This is a tenancy at will. You stay there till I tell you to leave, or you leave whenever you want to. Do you understand how it'd be almost impossible to actually set this thing up with rent being paid? So what's going to be the most likely way to have one of these things exist? It's free. Because most of the time, as soon as we pay rent, look where we are. We're sitting there at month to month. Does that make sense?
It makes sense what you're saying, but why would someone have an estate at will?
So why would they have an estate at will? Well, maybe you're a family member, you just letting them stay on a property you own. Or a friend. Yeah, my mom passed away and her house is empty, you can stay there for a couple months. That is an estate at will. Because I'm not bound to provide anything for that tenant, and they're not bound to me in any way. If they don't like where they're staying, what can they do? Leave. And I can tell them to leave at any point in time. It's basically just permission to stay in a place. That's what an estate at will is.
So if you tell them you can stay here as long as you like, and then all of a sudden next month,
You change your mind?
Go, and they say like, no, you said I could stay as long as I like.
They still have to leave. Because an estate at will means no binding action on either party's part. But remember, that probably means don't take any rent. Because if you tell somebody, well, you can stay as long as you want to, just pay me a couple $100 a month. As soon as they write you that check and you cash it, you're at month to month. And remember, month to month is going to automatically do what? It's going to automatically renew itself every month. So you have to be very careful with collecting rent if you don't want to have a periodic tenancy. Because month to month is a periodic tenancy, right? That's period to period. And then the last one, the estate at sufferance. This is basically trespassing. This is a tenant who has overstayed their welcome. They had a lease at one point in time, but they are supposed to have already vacated the property. They haven't vacated the property, and so therefore they are illegally in the property now. We sometimes call them a holdover tenant. So this would be a tenant that maybe you'd already given notice, you told them you didn't intend to renew their lease, you show up and they're still there. That's a holdover tenant. But remember, a holdover tenant can easily become a month-to-month tenant if you do what? If you accept rent from them. So you've got to always be careful about that acceptance of rent. Alright? So that's how leases are legally structured. 4 different ways that leases are legally structured. Now we want to talk about the way that leases are paid. How is the payment structure handled for a lease? Well, the first type is something called a gross lease. What does gross mean? When you talk about gross versus net, what does that mean?
Taxes.
Before taxes.
Well, before taxes, not really taxes. Taxes are an example of something,
Before deductions.
before deductions or expenses. That's the perfect definition. Gross is before expenses are deducted. So my gross pay is before anything comes out of it, right? Well, of course we know taxes come out, but it's not just taxes that come out of there. You've got unemployment insurance and FICA and Medicare and Social Security and federal income taxes and state income. There's all kinds of expenses that come out, correct?
Yeah, that is.
So gross means before expenses are deducted, whereas net means what? After expenses are deducted. So when we talk about a gross lease, what we mean is that the tenant pays one bill, one gross amount of money. And the landlord is responsible for everything after that. So if the property needs maintenance, who's going to pay for it? The landlord. If the property taxes need to be paid on the property, who's going to pay the property taxes? The landlord. Who's going to pay for the insurance on the property? The landlord. Does that make sense for you, everybody? That's a gross lease. So most residential leases are gross leases. Because if you think about a residential lease, you write one check. And you don't care how much the property taxes are, the insurance, or all those kinds of things, right? Because that's up to the landlord to deal with. That's a gross lease, and it's mostly in residential leasing. Most commercial leases are structured as net leases. So we said net means what? After taxes or expenses, after expenses are deducted. So the tenant is going to pay a net rent to the landlord. What that means from the landlord's perspective is they don't have to pay anything after that. Once they put the rent in their pocket, they're done. Because who's going to pay the taxes on the property? No. Who pays taxes on the property here? The landlord. If it was the same, why would we have two different categories? Right? So who's going to pay the taxes here? The tenant. Who's going to pay the maintenance here? The tenant. Who's going to pay all the expenses here? Insurance, taxes, maintenance. That HVAC system blows up and it's a $10,000 repair. Whose dime is that on? The tenant's. This is the structure of the vast majority of commercial leases. The vast majority of commercial leases are net leases. Not gross, but net leases. Here's the reason for this in commercial real estate as compared to residential real estate. When I go out and I lease my house, do I have a pretty good idea what the expenses are going to be for the next year? Or at least a reasonable idea? I know what the property taxes are going to be about, right? I know what my insurance is going to cost for the year. Does that make sense? And I can usually estimate what the maintenance is going to be for a year. Most residential leases, how long do we do them? A year. Commercial leases are very often 7 years, 10 years, 15 years, 25 years. Is it much harder to estimate what the expenses would be when I'm talking about leasing my property to somebody for the next 7 years?
Yeah.
So, as a landlord, to protect myself, rather than say, you pay me this and I'll pay all these expenses, I say, no, here's what I want in rent. You take the expenses. And if the expenses go up, guess what?
They go up.
They go up. You pay them. So the landlord knows that their rent is going to be absolutely steady during the time of that lease. Because if the expenses go up, that's on the tenant. This is the structure of the vast majority of commercial leases. Right? So what kind of leases are most residential leases? Gross. And when you talk about their legal structure, are they estates for years or are they periodic tenancies? So residential leases are usually periodic tenancies with what kind of rent payments? With gross rental payments. Does that make sense? And whereas commercial leases are usually what kind of leases? Net payment, but what's the legal structure? Estate for years or periodic tenancy? They're usually, commercial leases are usually estates for years with net rent payments. A lot of times in the commercial world we call them triple net leases because there's 3 expenses that get passed along. Taxes, insurance, and maintenance. Some commercial leases are structured as something called a percentage lease, specifically retail leases. In retail settings, a lot of times the rent is going to be some flat amount, which is very low, plus a percentage of whatever sales you do in that space. This is how shopping malls are rented.
Even the kiosks too, right?
Even the kiosks in the mall are rented this way. Why?
The malls are gold mine.
Why
Because
though?
they
Look
have
at it
to
for
pay-
first. Why from the mall's perspective?
Because they have to
Different
like
seasons.
pay for like the Christmas stuff or pay to get the maintenance done in there and
So from the mall's perspective, what you're saying is, if I do a bunch of stuff to drive traffic in there, I should benefit from that.
pretty much.
Yes, that's exactly right. Why from the tenant's perspective does this make sense?
Because they get a
Because
lot
they
of
have
traffic
slow
through.
seasons.
Bringing the traffic.
Because you got somebody helping you bring the traffic in, right? When your rent is based on how much you sell, then hopefully they're gonna help you sell. They're gonna help drive traffic to your store. Does that make sense? The other reason is that, quite honestly, retail revenues go up and down wildly throughout the year. Is revenue different in December than it is January in a retail setting? So when can they afford best to handle their rent?
Fall.
In December, November, December. When can they almost not afford their rent? In January. And so when you do a percentage lease, it allows you essentially to have your rent payments track with your revenue payments. You know, when you have, your rent goes up as your revenue goes up, and when you have that terrible month where revenue drops off, your rent also drops off. So it helps them weather the storm a little better. Does that make sense for everybody? Now, if you were going to do this, if you're going to go into commercial property management and do percentage leases, it's going to be very important to monitor the receipts of the stores in your facility. So, for example, like Crabtree Valley, they can sit in the office space of Crabtree Valley Mall, and they can watch every transaction happening in every store in that mall.
Wow.
They can see they have a real-time data feed from every retailer in that mall, so that they know exactly how much they've done in sales, so that they keep them honest and they can bill them for their rent at the end of the month.
Wow, didn't know that.
Okay?
Isn't like in commercial, when you rent them, like you say, their lease is like 15 years. The agent usually get paid like a percentage of the first month's rent or something like that.
No, you usually get paid as far as commissions on the commercial side. You talking about on the tenant side or the landlord side?
Landlord.
Well, if you're the property manager, which would be the landlord side, you
No, I'm
usually,
sorry, tenant. Sorry.
all right,
Tenant.
so on the tenant side, if you're representing the tenant, you usually pay a percentage of the total value of the lease.
Oh, okay.
So, for example, if I placed a tenant in a commercial setting, let's say we had a space that was 5,000 square feet, and it was a triple net lease at $16 a square foot. Okay, so that is $80,000 a year, and let's say we did a 7-year lease. That's $560,000, and say I was getting 3% of the value of the lease. It'd be a $16,800 commission when the tenant moved in. That's how those are handled, which generally speaking is going to be paid out of the tenant's security deposit. It's why commercial security deposits are drastically different than residential security deposits. Commercial security deposits don't have to be held on a trust account. So usually when they take, you know, like the first month's rent and a security deposit from a commercial tenant, they're using it to pay the commissions. And then after that, the money belongs to them, to the landlord. All right? Most expensive type of lease, a full service lease. A full service lease is going to be by far the most expensive type of lease that you can get. And this is done in office space. Not all office space is done with full service leases, but I can't think of any other space where you would get a full service lease. Full service leases include everything. It includes utilities, it includes janitorial service. Like for example, you notice they're in here cleaning the building at night, right? You notice I don't really pay much attention if I turn the lights off when I leave. You know why? Because I'm not paying for them. This is a full service lease. So they cover the utilities, the restocking the bathrooms, the cleaning, all of that is part of the lease payment. And that is a very common way to lease office space. And the reason for that is when you lease office space, you're usually sharing the building with multiple tenants. And so to maintain consistency, because you don't want to have, inevitably, if you had the tenants, okay, you clean your own space, you would have one that would just be nasty as hell, and it would that not turn other tenants away from the building when they come in and you got boxes stacked up and paper, and you see what I'm saying? So with office space, to keep it consistent, they usually go this full service route. Or you'd have that one, tenant that keep the heat on 90 degrees and somebody else would have it on 68, and so they just to maintain consistency, they go this full service route with office space. All right? Ground leases. A ground lease is a unique idea. Most of the time, we don't think of building something on someone else's land. But that's exactly what a ground lease is. A ground lease is when I am leasing the dirt, the ground. But I'm not leasing it to leave it bare. What am I going to do with it? I'm going to build something. Something like one of these. This company behind me does not make money selling hamburgers. The franchisees who own the individual restaurants make money selling hamburgers. You know how McDonald's makes money? They own that land. They own that land. And when you buy a McDonald's franchise, you sign a 100-year lease on that piece of land at an astronomical amount of money. You're not allowed to build that restaurant on land that you own. You can only construct a McDonald's on land that they own. So when you want to open a McDonald's franchise and you have a good location, you have to bring it to their attention, you pay them the franchise fee, they negotiate and purchase the land, and then you sign a 100-year lease to lease that land from them. That's how they make their money, by owning the land that the structure is built on. Of course, they get a percentage of the sales, but the real money's made in that ground lease. Okay? So a ground lease is any time. Now, let me ask you this. If you are leasing dirt, and you're going to spend all your money actually building something, because this McDonald's is not built by McDonald's, it's built by that franchisee. Don't you go on a long-term lease? Yes. I mean, if you're going to spend that much money building that store there, don't you want the lease? I mean, it'd be pretty bad if you had a 5-year lease and you had to tear the building down because your lease expired, right? Right. So what do you think the term of ground leases is going to be? Very what? Long. Cell phone towers are built with ground leases as well. When you see cell phone towers, that's usually a ground lease. The cell phone company very rarely owns the land that tower is on. They're usually leasing it, and leasing it for a very long period of time. Okay? So, what are the things that we look for in a lease that make it binding? Well, leases are just contracts. They are no different than any other contract. So think back to basic contract, all that stuff in Chapter 9. What did we say were like the essential elements of a contract? We had to have two parties that were what? Legally what? Competent. What did that mean? They're not, what are the things they couldn't be? They couldn't be intoxicated. They couldn't be mentally incapacitated. They couldn't be what? A minor. So we got to have two legally competent parties. There's got to be consideration in the contract. What is consideration? Money what? Exchanged between the two parties. There's got to be some promise to exchange money. Well, think about a lease. So would a lease that says, I'm leasing you my property for free, would that be a lease at all? It's not, because it doesn't have consideration. What would you need to do? Lease it to them for what? $1. How often do we hear that? Oh, we're doing it for $1. Well, there's a reason for that, because contractually you don't have an agreement unless there's some consideration that changes hands. All right? And it's got to be for a legal act. You can't have any contract for an illegal act. You need to know this terminology. You will probably see this on an exam, this idea of upfit. This happens in commercial real estate. This is a commercial real estate thing right here. Not residential at all. This is going to be exclusively in commercial real estate. Commercial tenants, like me, need very specialized spaces. Give me an example of what I would need as a commercial tenant running a real estate school that would be different than, say, your average office rent or tenant.
You need classrooms.
I need classrooms. I need big rooms. Would you find this size room in most normal office suites?
No.
How about the one next door that's twice this size?
No.
Absolutely not, right? Do you think that's the way this building was constructed?
No.
No. What do you think used to be in here?
Small
Lots
rooms.
and lots of small rooms. See, these walls in commercial real estate, that thing's just an illusion. Because when you walk into a space, that wall can be gone tomorrow and moved over there. And if you go in a commercial, to a commercial broker, when you walk in this room and they say, well, you know, I don't need a room this big, I need 4 offices. They'll be like, come back in 3 days. And guess what they'll have in here? 4 offices. That's called upfit. When you customize the space for the tenant's use, it's called upfit. It's not repair, it's not fixing it up, it's customization. It's asking the tenant, what do you need the space to be? Oh, you need a bathroom? Guess what? There were no bathrooms in here. When we looked at this space, there was no bathrooms in here. The only bathrooms in the building were the ones in the lobby out there. And I said, that's not enough bathrooms. When we take breaks, it's not going to be enough. So you know what they did? They took 3 offices in the middle and they turned them into what? Bathrooms. That's an example of upfit. And why do you think a commercial landlord is willing to do that? Why are they willing to spend that money and make that investment and upfit this property? Because, why is it a better return? Because I'm willing to pay more what? More rent. The more you upfit the space for me, the higher my rental amount's going to be, and probably the longer amount of time you're going to want me to commit to. Does that make sense? If I am having you upfit the space, you're probably going to want a longer period of time as far as the time commitment goes. How we feel about that term? Everybody good on upfit? What kind of real estate are we talking about? Commercial. Good. Good. All right. We need to talk about what an assignment and a sublease is. So let's talk about the basics of what's happening here. In either an assignment or a sublease, the original tenant wants out of the lease. For whatever reason, and this is almost always going to be in commercial real estate. You're very rarely going to see assignment or sublease in residential real estate. Because residential real estate is usually for pretty short term. We said it's for what? Most of them, a year, right? A period like a year, the longest. That's a relatively short amount of time. If somebody breaks a year lease, you usually aren't asking them to find a new tenant. You just go out and find your own new tenant. But what if somebody's in year 3 of a 15-year lease? Is that a problem when their business shuts down? Yes. Because do they owe those other 12 years of rent? They absolutely do. So, what might a tenant who finds themselves in that situation want to do? If they own a restaurant, and that restaurant has gone out of business, and they still have 12 years left on their lease, rather than pay 12 years of rent for a space that's empty, what might they try to do?
So get rid of it.
I'm sorry?
Get out of their contract.
Well, they can't get out of their contract unless they find somebody else to do what?
Take over.
To take it over. So let's say what they're really going to do. They're not trying to get out of their contract. There's no such thing. What are they trying to find? Someone else who can pay that rent in their place over the next 12 years. there's two different ways we can handle that. There's two different ways we can handle putting a new tenant in that space. They're called assignment and sublease. One is better for the landlord, the other is better for the tenant. But in both cases, the same thing's happening. One tenant's going out and they're trying to get somebody else to come in and take their place. What did we say an assignment was when we talked about contract law? Changing the what? Changing the people, the parties, right? So if we do an assignment with a lease, what parties do you think we're changing? Who's coming off and who's going on? Landlord or tenant?
Tenant.
Tenant. The old tenant's coming off and a new tenant is coming in their place. Here's the benefit of an assignment to the old tenant. They're no longer on the lease. They might have some ultimate responsibility, but the big thing is their name is where? It's not on the lease anymore because the new tenant has taken their place. So ultimately, when it's time for the rent to be paid, where is the landlord looking? Old tenant or new tenant?
New tenant.
New tenant. With a sublease, the old tenant stays on the lease. So who's still ultimately responsible for the rent with a sublease? The old tenant. The new tenant may be paying the rent. They may be paying some portion of the rent. But ultimately, if the rent's not paid, who is the landlord going to look to?
The old tenant.
The old tenant. So if you're the tenant, which one would you rather have? I'd rather have an assignment if I'm a tenant. If you're the landlord, which one would you rather have? Sublease. Because if you got a sublease, don't you really have two shots at the rent being paid?
Yeah.
You got the new tenant who's supposed to be paying, and if they don't pay, you've still got the old tenant who's legally responsible. Does that make sense? But in both cases, we're finding a new tenant to take the place of the old one. How do you feel about those? Okay, good. What right does the landlord have to enter the property? None. Unless the tenant gives them that right. And how would a tenant give that right to the landlord?
Like if the landlord gave them notice and said.
No.
That's after the tenant's already given them the right.
So
Okay.
generally, they call it the right of entry. on a
Okay.
lease. So they'll reserve the right to enter the premises at like any reasonable time.
So where did they reserve that right?
In the lease.
In the lease. So the only way the landlord actually has the legal right to enter that property at all during the of that lease is if the lease gives them that right. So remember, we don't have to have written leases in North Carolina. We can have oral leases, right? What are they going to be? What kind of leases are they going to be?
Month to month.
They're going to be month-to-month leases. Is the landlord going to, if we have an oral month-to-month lease, is the landlord going to have any right to enter that property for any reason?
No.
No, because they didn't reserve that right in a written lease agreement. It is very important, if the landlord wants to have access to that property at all, to put that in the lease. Because otherwise they're trespassing. They are breaking and entering if they enter that property, if they don't reserve the legal right to enter it. Okay?
So when they reserve the legal right, they do or don't have to give notice?
Depends on what, that would depend on what
Depends on what it
it
says
says in the lease. It would have to specify exactly under what circumstances they have the right to enter that property. And so it should set up and say, we can come in for this reason and we have to give you this much notice. So most standardized leases would say that the landlord has the right to enter the property for emergency purposes. Like for example, if there's suspicion of flooding, or if they go up to the property and they see water coming out around the front door, they have the right to open the door and go in there and figure out what's going on. Or if the house is on fire, or that's something of that nature. And then it would usually have some statement about they would have the right to enter the property for maintenance or inspections with 24 hours notice. But again, all of those reasons and time periods would need to be specified in the lease, because if you don't say it, you don't have the right. That's a really important thing to remember. It's not, we think, oh, it's my house, I have the right to go in there. That is not true. Because you gave up that right to possession when you leased them the property. I'm sorry. We talked about the fact that leases don't have to be in writing in North Carolina, which means they're not covered by what law? The statute of fraud. Leases do not have to be in writing to be enforceable. However, what's the default? What do you get when you don't ask for something special? What kind of lease are you going to get if you have an oral lease? It's going to be month to month. So if you want anything other than month to month, you've got to do what with it? You've got to put it in writing. So just because we say you can have oral leases, does that mean that Sharon and I can make an oral lease for a year?
No.
Can we do that? No. We could say it, but it's not going to be enforceable. Because if we go to court and I say, well, she agreed, Your Honor, she agreed to lease the property from me for a year. What are they going to ask me for? Proof. That's exactly right. If I say, well, we didn't put it in writing, what kind of lease are they going to say she has? Month to month. Does that follow for everybody? So no, they don't have to be in writing to be enforceable unless you want something other than month to month. And then they do have to be in writing. Now, we talk about right here probably one of the most confused things in the whole class. It says leases of more than 3 years must also be recorded to be enforceable against third persons. So let me give you an example here. Let's say that we have a lease, all right? And we have Zach, who's the landlord, and Jen, who's the tenant. Zach owns a strip mall shopping center, and he leases a space in the strip mall for 7 years to Jen, and she's going to operate a little boutique. Is everybody with me? Now they put that lease in writing because they know it has to be in writing because it's something other than month to month. Is everybody good with me? Now we're 2 years into this lease, so Jen still has how many years left on her lease? 5, right? The property is sold. Zach puts the property up for sale and he sells it to Josh. Normally, when a property is sold, does the new owner have to honor leases that are on that property?
Yes.
They do. Unless the lease was for longer than 3 years. In which case, the new owner does not have to honor that lease unless it has been what? Recorded. So, here's our scenario. Jen leased that space from Zach for 7 years. How long does Zach have to honor that lease?
7 years.
7 years. Doesn't matter to him because he's not a third party. He signed the lease, right? So as long as he owns the building, does Jen have a lease?
Yes.
Absolutely. But if Zach sells that property to Josh, and that lease was not recorded, Josh can kick Jen out the next month. Or double her rent. Or do anything he wants to do. Because he's not required to honor that lease because it was not what? Recorded, and because it was longer than 3 years. Now, if it was only a 2-year lease, would that be the case?
No.
No. 2-year lease, he'd have to honor it. Does that make sense? But because it was a 7-year lease, and he bought that property and it was not recorded, then he doesn't have to honor that lease. So, in whose best interest is it to record the lease? Who loses in that deal? Jen. So who should record that lease? The tenant. The tenant should. The landlord doesn't care about recording it. In fact, they'd probably rather not. Because think about what the conversation is going to be like between Zach and Josh. Zach's going to say to Josh, by the way, the tenant over there in 102, she's got 5 years left on her lease, but she didn't record it. So as soon as we close, you can go down there and double her rent. See, it's not in the landlord's best interest, is it? No. In fact, the landlord hopes you don't know that law. But as a tenant, what should you do as soon as that lease is signed? Go record it. The idea here is to protect Josh. Because if he buys that building and there's long-term leases, he should know that before he closes because he's going to have to honor them. Does that make sense? And the best way for him to know it is to what? to record them, because when he does a title search, anything recorded on that property is gonna come up in that title search. Does that make sense? So when he gets ready to go to closing, he does a title search, he's gonna be like, whoa, I didn't realize this thing was leased for 7 years. See what I mean? Okay? So make sure you understand that. Leases don't have to be in writing, but if you want something other than month to month, they gotta be in writing. And if they are for longer than 3 years, it is in the tenant's best interest to record them so that they're protected for the full term of the lease. All right? All right, let's take a break right here. Okay? And we'll come back and talk about residential leases specifically, the Residential Rental Agreements Act. You can't do that. The next time it won't be that gentle. If you're gonna